It's my very, very great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Altea Pericoli from Lund University. We'll be talking today about aid from Gulf countries in conflict zones. Dr. Pericoli's research has the overall objective to provide a broader understanding of humanitarian aid in conflict zones as implemented by Gulf actors, and to improve the dialogue between Western and Gulf donors. Her research examines foreign aid interventions of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates in particular, and the implementation of their policies in Yemen, Sudan, Syria, which will include, of course, and embrace the Syrian refugee issue. And I think you're going to be taking us to look at Gaza as well as part of your talk. And she's going to be looking specifically at the period from 2015 to the present day. Her study combines international relations theories and an anthropological approach to humanitarian aid analysis. And what she does is to bring together a top-down and bottom-up observation of aid interventions of these particular countries. So without further ado, would you all join me in welcoming Altea to give today's lecture?
Thank you so much. Thank you to Durham University and the Luce Fellowship and the Institute for Middle Eastern Islamic Studies, and also to all people and professors that I met during these days at Durham University for the warm welcome here. And as Professor John said, this is part of a broader study that I'm conducting during my postdoc at Lund University, and I will continue through a Marie Curie Fellowship at Princeton University and Ca' Foscari in Venice. And part of this study will be published in a book by Edinburgh University Press entitled Islamic Aid and Gulf Donors in Contemporary Crisis. But why this research project? Because I think that the narrative of the international humanitarian order rooted in the Western history has dominated the literature on humanitarian response in crisis and conflict zones. But other players, including the Gulf donors, are part of the picture and have emerged in the international landscape, demonstrating that while the concern for people who are suffering can be universal, the responses get different regarding the different cultural and political backgrounds of both donors and recipients. And starting from a very simple form of curiosity, I wonder, how are Gulf states operating in conflict zones and protected crises? And also, is Islam playing a role in these aid dynamics? And I think this is particularly important if we consider that most of the countries where we have ongoing protracted conflict are Muslim majority countries. Some of them are in the MENA region, and in 2023 ACLED published this conflict index ranking where we have among the extreme situations Syria, Palestine, Yemen, and also Sudan, Afghanistan, and Iraq have been affected by humanitarian emergencies and crises in the last decades. And in this humanitarian international landscape, the Gulf states are part of the response in the humanitarian crisis with their different Islamic background and political interests, and have an active role in financing and implementing aid intervention, especially in the MENA region, starting from 1970s. So they are not actually new or emerging donors as the literature has defined them. Therefore, I decided to focus on the evolution of the Gulf states as donors, and also the theoretical framework in which I'm described the top-down and bottom-up dynamics of aid, where the top-down analysis is based on the analysis of the elaboration of policies by the states, and the bottom-up is the interaction between charities and recipients on the ground. And the analysis is based on the three case studies, Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and we will see the application of their foreign aid strategy in some case studies. So the comparison between Qatar and the UAE, in Sudan, Syria, and Gaza, and also the case of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Just to give you a few details on the methodology, so the research is based on qualitative data collected through semi-structured interviews conducted during my fieldwork in Qatar, and also remote interviews with actors in the Gulf states at the institutional level and humanitarian workers in conflict zones from 2021 to 2023. I'm also using secondary sources from governmental institutions such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Qatar for Development, Abu Dhabi for Development, the Saudi Aid Platform, and also the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center, integrating the institutional level with the charity level, looking at the annual reports of the state-sponsored charities in the three countries. The triangulation of data, for the triangulation of data, the study refers to UN platform, including OCHA, Financial Tracking Services, and also UNRWA in the case of Gaza or other UN organizations. Just to start with a brief excursus on the historical evolution of the Gulf states, of course, many events have affected the evolution of the state as donors from 1970s, but I have identified here four main moments in the most recent history. And we have the 2001 with the 9/11 and the accusation of the Gulf states of supporting terrorism through charity and aid. And this pushed this state and Islamic organization to a form of professionalization and institutionalization to be aligned in the international framework of the aid response. And also a form of rebranding and improve the transparency and collaboration with the UN agencies. The 2011 and the Arab Spring have increasingly politicized the Gulf states foreign aid, and in terms of aid flow politicization, I think is reflected in three main elements. The increase in funds invested in development assistance, especially bilaterally, the interruption of the correlation between the oil prices and the aid resources in the period 2012-2014, and the geographical allocation of funds per each donor in line with their political objective that followed the transformation that was happening at that time in different countries during the Arab Spring. The third geopolitical event that affected the aid dynamics was the Gulf crisis and the related Qatari embargo in 2017, which enhanced the competition among donors in terms of resources allocation. And I think this is particularly evident in the case of the Horn of Africa, and we will see the case of Sudan today, but also pushed Qatar to rebrand its image as a donor and allocate more resources in multilateral channel to improve its credibility and align its efforts in the international arena of humanitarian response. The last moment, 2021, towards a new regional diplomacy, I think still a question mark, because the regional order after the end of the Qatari embargo could be seen as a sign of the beginning of a new regional diplomacy, but other events like the Abraham Accords and also Gaza after the 7th of October, I think will influences the evolution of the aid landscape and opens a new debate on the role of the Gulf state as donors and mediator in the region through a form of cooperation and coordination of aid. Three main concepts and big words: humanitarians, politics, and Islam. And I wondered how they are related to each other and if they are related to each other. There is a very interesting book written by Miriam Bradley, published in 2023, The Politics of Everyday Practice of International Humanitarianism, where she said that humanitarian action is often understood as something different from and separate from politics, narrowly defined, and humanitarianism is seen as a sphere of moral action, while politics implies self-interest. However, if we look at how humanitarian looks like and not what it should be and do, we can see the strong interconnection between politics and humanitarian response. And so humanitarianism is often perceived as an apolitical action, but when humanitarian intervention are driven by political interest, especially when the state or the donors of are involved in the humanitarian operation and financing, and also humanitarian intervention have political effect when resources are allocated in a certain context or towards certain groups, when we have fragmented sovereignty or fragmented context, as we will see in the case of non-state actors or controlled areas in the case of Syria and also Yemen and Sudan. So in the case of Islam, we have some principles that inspire the apolitical approach to humanitarianism that, again, can be affected by the donor's intention or can be altered when they interact with dynamics on the ground. And regarding the principle that inspire the relationship between humanitarian and Islam, we have three main concepts. The concept of amana, trustship, the concept of adala ijtimaiya, social justice, and the concept of ihsan. And the concept of amana is strongly linked with the charitable obligation and wealth redistribution. And this is a form of trustship where all the things that belong to God are handed over the human beings for their collective well-beings. And humans are not the owners of the property, rather they are entrusted with resources. And this creates a form of spiritual responsibility to use these resources for expanding and the ihsan and create the social justice. So we have two main implications from this framework. On one hand, we have a financial implication where this concept of redistribution creates instruments such as zakat, sadaqah, and waqf that are used today for humanitarian purposes by state and non-state actors, and also Muslim and non-Muslim organizations, as in the case of UNHCR Refugee Zakat Fund, that is trying to fill the gap in the humanitarian conventional financing through Zakat Fund to find a sustainable way to support the Syrian, the refugee response in many countries and in Muslim majority communities. And at the political level, we have this concept of solidarity with the Ummah beyond the national borders, which was at the core of the elaboration of the foreign aid policies in 1970s, and it's also part of the strategy of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and Islamic Development Bank. So how humanitarianism, Islam, and foreign aid are related? This relationship in the analysis of regional actor and Gulf donor strategies implies a sort of identity and religious motivation together with the political interest in the allocation and implementation of aid on the ground, and assuming that aid has always a political dimension and that the institutional, cultural, religious background play a role in shaping the dynamics, I built a theoretical framework that can bring together all these elements in the analysis of the Gulf states' foreign aid, because I think that what remains problematic is how foreign aid by the Gulf states has been analyzed through the existing international relation theories, including neoclassical realism, constructivism, and rationalism, and these existing theories seems to be not completely adequate to explain foreign policy and consequently foreign aid by the Gulf states. And the starting point of this analysis is rooted in the theory elaborated by Professor Teshami of complex realism. So, Professor, thank you for this inspiration. And where we have trans-state, sub-state, and supra-state identities are necessary to unpacking the elaboration process of actors' foreign policies in the MENA region. So considering all these existing theoretical frameworks, I'll try to apply them to the study of Gulf states' foreign aid policies, and I have identified three main levels of analysis. So we have the role of Islam, the religious background, and the Islamic identity of the Gulf state considered, where we have the bottom-up and top-down level of analysis, and the top-down is mainly related to the position taken towards political Islam and the role that Islam plays in the elaboration of the foreign aid policy. And the bottom-up is the way in which Islam functions as a tool for interaction between charities and beneficiaries on the ground, and this is connected to the anthropological approach and the concept of cultural proximity, where common religious background or cultural background between recipients and between recipients and donors can facilitate the access in a certain context for some organizations compared to others. The second element is the decision-making process and the relationship between the elite in the donor country and the one in the recipient context. And the third one, consider the projection of power and the relevance of the geopolitical dynamics in the analysis of foreign aid. So these three levels of analysis are related to the 8 parameters influence the 8 parameters on which the observation and comparison of the donors is based. The first one is the geographical allocation of resources at the macro level, where we have selection of the recipient countries, and then at the micro level, the selection of targeted communities or groups in the same country, especially when we have fragmented context. The second element is the sector allocation, so the preference through education, health, food security, or the budget support, and then the channel allocation of aid, means multilateral channel, UN agencies, bilateral, so state-state, international non-governmental organization, and country-based charities. I want to focus more on the elite decision-making process and the institutional dimension of aid in the 3 countries. So we have the case of Qatar, where we have a very centralized elaboration of policy with the Department of International Cooperation within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Emir are in charge of elaborating the policy directions that are today described in 2 main documents, Qatari National Vision Policy 2030 and the Third National Development Strategy 2024-2030. In 2002, was created the Qatar for Development, which has the aim to improve this executive competence of aid and is in charge of financing intervention, planning programs and projects on the ground, and also the monitoring and evaluation department is within the Qatar for Development. So we have no implementation of the ground, but we have an implementation of policies. In 2014, Qatar created the Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities, with the role of coordinating all the efforts between the ministry and the charity, so the institutional level with the implementation level, and also the approval funds. So all the funds that are spent abroad should be have to be approved by RACA. And then we have the implementation level with Qatar Charity and Qatar Red Crescent Society. They are the most important charities in the country that can operate through private funds and governmental funds. But again, RACA is supervising and approving all the funds spent abroad. And I remember when I was in Qatar, this was this debate on how to improve the system within the country and how to coordinate better the aid approach. And of course, with positive and negative aspects, this is a way to improve the transparency, improve the image of the donor, and the management between the different level in the country, but also some charities had some complaints about the approval for funds that can slow down sometimes operation on the ground, especially when we have humanitarian emergencies and we need a fast response in emergencies. The case of United Arab Emirates, we have a centralized elaboration of policies, but fragmented in implementation. Why? In 2016, the Ministry of International Development merged with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and became the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperations, where we have it has the role of the policy, elaborating the policy directions, and also financing humanitarian and development intervention. And the policy direction are described in the UAE Foreign Assistance Policy launched in 2017. In the case of the UAE, we have a separate entity created in 1971, the Abu Dhabi for Development, that is financing exclusively development intervention through bilateral agreement, soft loans, and grant. The coordination level is divided per each emirate. So we have the Islamic Affairs and Charitable Activities Department per each emirate, and then at the implementation level, all the emirates have created their own charitable organization. So we have Dubai Cares, or Zayed Charitable and Humanitarian Foundation, Khalifa bin Zayed and Layan Foundation, and we have just one implementing agencies at the centralized level, that is the Emirati Red Crescent Society. So compared to Qatar, I think that the UAE, in the case of the UAE, we have the decision-making process appears fragmented and managed by different figures within the elite, especially like the foreign aid strategy are the results of a federation process elaborated by multiple actors, especially among the elite of Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And then we have all this implementation level that appears fragmented because most of the organization, the charitable organization, are linked to key personality of different emirates and reflecting the fragmentation of policies and the intention to pursue the interests of each emirate in third countries. In the case of Saudi Arabia, we have a clear distinction between humanitarian and development operations. We have the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Finance, and the Cabinet contributing to the Department of the International Development Cooperation. And this distinction between humanitarian and development started in 2015 when Saudi Arabia created the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center. And then we have the Saudi Fund for Development for the implementation and financing of development intervention by soft loans and grants and through bilateral agreement. And both the King Salman and the Saudi Fund for Development can contribute to the development of policies. At the implementation level, we have the Saudi Red Crescent Authority, and also some members of the royal family have their own charitable foundation, such as Al Walid Foundation, formally established in 2015. Saudi Arabia made an effort after the creation of the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center in sense of transparency, because they created the Saudi Aid Platform, and where 15 Saudi government agencies have reported their aid flow from 1975 to 2022. So in this platform, we have all the aid flow of these different agencies divided by sectors, years, and organization. Just a brief technical evaluation before going to the case studies. Here we can see the humanitarian contribution, exclusively the humanitarian, we don't have development funds here, of Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar compared. And we can see that Saudi Arabia is the most consistent large-scale humanitarian donor, having quadrupled the aid from 2017 to 2018, and the UAE exhibit a similar pattern of funding, having increased nearly tenfold in the same period. But these patterns of funding show inconsistency among the Gulf states. Kuwait funding in the same year saw drastic changes, with a high level of aid in 2015 with 464 million to a low level of 2 million in 2021. And in the case of Qatar, while its humanitarian assets are the lowest of these four study donors, it has by far the most consistent contribution, averaging $83 million per year. Looking at the top recipient countries, so here we have Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. And if we look at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, since the start of the Yemeni war, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have provided more humanitarian aid to Yemen than any other recipients, while Qatar shows, like the Qatar's contribution to Yemen did not show a consistent pattern, and Qatar showed a greater diversity in its disbursement of aid compared to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But all these three states exhibited similar focus on Arab states, making their aid regionally specific rather than a broader commitment to global aid. So we can start with the case studies. The first one is the case of Syria, and this is based on interviews conducted also with humanitarian workers on the ground, with charities, and also UN agencies, including OCHA, Damascus, and OCHA Gaziantep, because the management of aid within Syria is managed in a different way. The area controlled by the regime are under the OCHA Damascus, and the operation in the northeast of Syria are managed by OCHA Gaziantep in Turkey, and they are not talking to each other and coordinate operation among the two areas. Looking at Qatar and the UAE, so Qatar supported the opposition and to challenge the status quo during the Arab Spring, and despite its initial opposition to the Syrian regime, the UAE then tried to normalize the relation with Damascus that became explicit in December 2018. And due to their different positions assumed by Qatar and the UAE in the Syrian crisis, the question here was if the sectarian approach to the conflict and the fragmentation of the opposition put in place by these two external supporters was reflected in how policies of aid were implemented. And it is important, I think, to have in mind that aid system in general, and in the specific case of Syria, is not an organic whole, and it is a structure built on asymmetrical powers, contested sovereignties, and sometimes also competing and contradictory goals. So here we can see the flow of Qatar, and here the case of the UAE, both in controlled areas, in regime-controlled areas, and opposition-controlled areas. So Qatar and the UAE, through their assistance, follow two parallel lines of recovery. On one side, Qatar operates following its political priorities, financing intervention within and outside the UN coordinating response, and the analysis of project finance show us significant evidence from the geographical allocation of aid and the types of project implemented, because Qatari policy does not follow the potential reconstruction plan of the regime, but it operates in area controlled by de facto authorities that are today the Syrian Salvation Government in Idlib and the Syrian Interim Government in northern Aleppo. So the aid allocation followed the recapture of the history of the conflict and the recapture of the territory. And when the regime recaptured some areas, the Qatar disappeared from that area of the country. And on the contrary, we have an opposite approach of the UAE, because the UAE strategy of aid in Syria maintains a double approach in a different direction, because Emirates support the multilateral channel through the Syrian Humanitarian Response Plan and the Syria Recovery Trust Fund, but it also financed bilaterally the Syrian government, and also in the case of southern Syria, after the regime recapture. So even in this case, the geographical allocation of aid in the country as a meaning that should be underlined and understood. So between 2016 and 2018, in southern Syria, Assad forces reclaimed dozens of oppositional areas, including the southern governorates in Dara and Quneitra, and the UAE financial support followed this allocation in terms of geographical response. Just a general consideration, I think that the politicization of aid in the Syrian crisis results in intervention implemented on two parallel lines, as we can see from this comparison, and represent a decentralized and uncoordinated response in a post-conflict recovery within a system that is trying to re-establish a centralized power. So this is just to conclude for the case of Syria. And here we have the case of Sudan. So the analysis of Sudan consider the period 2014-2022. And I think that we can find some elements in common. So the main differences that can be identified when we compare Qatar and the UAE approaches in Sudan, I divided three main differences respectively for Qatar and the UAE. So we have an humanitarian response versus development intervention, state-based charities versus bilateral and institutional approach, and then in terms of identity, we have the sense of autonomy for Qatar versus security for the UAE. I think that the domestic and regional dynamics can partially explain the characteristic if we look at this chart. So in the first period, 2014-2017, both Qatar and the UAE increased their influence in Sudan using the ambivalent position of al-Bashir towards the Islamist movement and the need for security in the Red Sea for the UAE and Saudi Arabia. However, the amount of resources allocated by the UAE is greater compared to Qatar, with bilateral and development intervention by the former and humanitarian efforts, mainly in Darfur, for the latter through its charities. During the GCC crisis, so starting from 2017, the commitment of the UAE to the central government decreased due to the declaration of neutrality of al-Bashir, and at the same time, Qatar significantly increased the efforts in Darfur, but also allocated $85 million in development intervention through bilateral channels directly to the central government of Sudan. So this could be explained as the willingness of the Qatari elite to maintain a strong tie with al-Bashir during the GCC crisis through the direct support of Khartoum, and also maintain its presence in Darfur. With the end of the al-Bashir 2019, the UAE increased its commitment to bilateral aid to support the new government and expand its influence in the country. And Qatar instead increased its effort in the multilateral channel in order to remain a donor and also maintain its presence in the international arena. So here we can see the division of data for Qatar, and I think that the capacity of Qatar to penetrate the difficult context of Darfur through its organization, namely Qatar Charity and Qatar Red Crescent Society, made these Gulf states one of the most active humanitarian donors in the region and one of the most important mediators between Darfur and the central government. And with the assistance of Qatar, the transitional government signed the Juba Agreement in 2020. So Qatar remained in the peripheries, but at the same time at the core of the mediation effort, with a reduction of funds in terms of bilateral funds, so through the Sudanese government and multilateral aid, and continue its interventions through Qatar Charity and Qatar Red Crescent Society in Darfur and Eastern Sudan in terms of humanitarian intervention. In the case of the UAE put more efforts into development and bilateral aid through the budget support to ensure the economic stability of the country and protect its economic and security interests in Sudan, also counterbalancing the presence of Qatar. Both of them have a very limited effort in multilateral channel. That means that they want to take advantages of their relationship between the local authorities in the peripheries for Qatar and the political and military elite in the central government for the UAE. The case of Gaza, I think that follows similar partners as Sudan and Syria in terms of Qatar and the UAE diverging approach in the same context, with autonomy and security as the two main traits of the two countries, respectively. But before going to the comparison, I want to describe the picture of the Gaza humanitarian delivery and delivering of aid in Gaza Strip. And I'm defining here the exceptionality of Gaza because I have identified four main traits that we cannot find in any other context and conflict zones that can represent an exception in terms of delivery and management of aid in the street. So the first one is the geographical allocation, the geographical isolation, and the control of the borders by Israel. And we can see in the map that we have two crossing points in the south, Rafah at the Egyptian border and Kerem Shalom at the Israeli border, and one in the north, Eretz, exclusively for people entering and exiting. And the second aspect, and this regards also the entrance of the humanitarian aid. The second aspect regards the political circumstances about Hamas as a de facto authority that controls the Strip and the consequent boycott of the US and the European Union, among other actors. But despite this boycott, both of them continue to support the aid intervention in Gaza with a no-contact policy with Hamas and channeling resources exclusively through the United Nations agencies. So the no-contact policy means that these donors, they were not directly interactive with Hamas in the aid management, and they are not giving funds to Hamas directly. And this aspect brings to the third feature, which regards the lack of local ownership in the aid coordination and management, because the international boycott of Hamas imposed new conditions of donors' organizations, and the UN agencies were obliged, of course, to resume their operation in Gaza under the policies of boycotting, avoiding any form of direct interaction with Hamas institution, but also civil society organization that were linked to Hamas. So the population was receiving aid in a passive way, and also this explains why the mainstream strategies of aid in Gaza and the coordination mechanisms bring to the prolonged humanitarian assistance in the Strip. And for definition, the humanitarian response should be a short or medium response to an emergency. But in the case of Gaza, we have very few objectives in terms of development and continue to be a humanitarian response in the long term. This just to give the big picture of the humanitarian response in Gaza. And here we can see the 4 Gulf states compared. Data are aggregated per both West Bank and Gaza because it's very difficult to disaggregate the data. But we have the UAE from 2017 to 2022, Qatar as a second donor, and then Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And here we can see the pledge to UNRWA from 2007 to 2015 to 2022. It's good to have in mind that the pledge of donors does not necessarily represent the paid contribution. Because here we can see how the second chart. So the paid and pledge are never the same. And so the consideration should be made on data about the paid contribution. But if we look at the empirical evidence about the aid flow of Qatar and the UAE, the first aspect regards the fluctuation in resources allocation. So both the aid flows of Qatar and the UAE have declined from 2017 to 2019, with a new significant increase of Qatari funds in 2020 and a decrease after 2020 of the UAE. Abraham Accords here can partially explain the variation of these funds after 2020. And the two donors present divergent behaviors also in terms of channel and sectoral allocation of resources, along with the interaction with local organization on the ground. So the main characteristic is that Qatari approach challenged the mainstream approach of no-contact policy and implement intervention through the coordination with Hamas institution, including the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Development, and Ministry of Agriculture, to agreement by Qatar for Development and Qatar Charity. So this bypasses the no-contact policy and embeds a direct and formal involvement of Hamas administration and local CSOs in the process. On the contrary, the UAE channeled foreign aid mainly in 2 directions. We have bilateral support to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and multilateral support to UNRWA for intervention in Gaza in the form of earmarked contribution and education sector. So the UAE followed the mainstream approach of the no-contact policy through UNRWA donation, and Qatar had a completely different approach due to the elite decision-making process and relationship with Hamas. So this aspect also of the donation in UNRWA reflects some behaviors of the two donors. So Doha relies on its presence in the territory for delivering and implementing aid, and we can see a peak of funds in 2018, quite stable and small amounts in the following years. And the UAE instead concentrated its grant to UNRWA from 2017 to 2019, with no data available of paid donation from 2020 to 2022, despite the pledge made to UNRWA of 106 million that are registered in the UNRWA donor chart. So just to conclude the case of Gaza, we have the identity dimensions, autonomy versus security, the relationship with Hamas, and the relationship with Israel that have affected the allocation of aid. The last case study doesn't work. Okay. So we have Saudi Arabia, Yemen, shortly. Here we can see for funding entity, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center is the two main agencies financing aid in the country. And except for 2005, the major contribution started after 2012. But why the Ministry of Finance? And because if we look at the top funded sectors, we have development, industry and mineral resources, support to banking sector, and the third sector is the general humanitarian aid by Saudi Arabia as a sector's contribution. That is the top one in terms of number of projects, as we can see in the second image, but not in terms of funding in the period considered. So Adi government was the largest direct recipient of Saudi aid, and government-controlled areas become the most recurrent destinations, and these geographical patterns tended to shift in line with the developments in the war, as in the case of Syria. So again, the geographical allocation followed the excursus of the conflict, and as the Houthi took the hold in the south, the southern and central governorates acquired renewed importance. So the period between 2018 and 2022 is particularly demonstrative of the relationship between foreign aid and the projection of power and control. And also Saudi Arabia tried to put the attention on the response to the humanitarian crisis in the international arena. Saudi Arabia hosted the International Donor Conference with the United Nations in 2020 to raise funds for Yemen, and the event raised 1.35 billion, with the Saudi Arabia as the largest donor with 500 million, also through the Saudi Development and Reconstruction Program for Yemen, that was established in 2018, and is a program that operates under a comprehensive development agreement between the government of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And this is an extension of the kingdom efforts to move the attention from the humanitarian response to development intervention. More attention to the development and institutional economic dynamics can be explained as a way to ensure the Saudi influence in any post-conflict scenario while shaping the political economic arrangements in the domestic order. Some conclusion, I know I really know the time. Yeah, so all these case studies, I think, that shed light on the implementation policies on the ground and how the identity of these donors combined with the geopolitical dynamics can explain their behavior as donors in the region. But regarding some technical evaluation of the humanitarian intervention in conflict zones, I think there are some elements to consider. And the first one is a lack of coordination between Gulf states and also Gulf states with Western actors. And the second one is a sense of mistrust among humanitarian organizations on the ground that I think can be reduced through a more logistic coordination and also through a better knowledge of this intervention and these actors. Therefore, I think that, of course, research and data on this field are essential to build a constructive framework. Thank you.